People often refer to Africa as if it is a country rather than a continent. It is a continent and home to 54 independent, unique countries, with South Sudan being the latest addition. Each country has its own currency, flag, anthem, history, cuisine, music, identity, and blend of cultures. Africa is also bigger than what most people think. If you combine the USA, China, India, Europe, and Japan, they all can fit into Africa. With wars, revolution, children soldiers making the news, it's no wonder that the myths about Africa being a dangerous place is a common one. And of course, bad news is news. Misconceptions and challenges in Africa.
Maybe there's so many myths. I have to think hard about a myth about Africa. Are there myths that we need to dispel about Africa? I think one of them is the myth of brain drain, the argument that when African scientists leave Africa, that the continent gets poorer and therefore underperforms.
People believe that Africa is just one country. Africa is a very big continent, and it's like Asia and has many, many countries. And various countries are at different stages of development and also have different types of problems. So we are usually lumped in one category as a useless continent, where most of the times what you read in the paper is very negative.
A large part of the entire problem with dealing with Africa, it's often prescriptive, and it doesn't take into account the needs of the people. Who knows best what the needs of the people are? It's the people.
Welcome to Second Saturday. I'm your host, Professor Alfonso Severos. This is Episode 2, Africa, Development and Future. As the new decade slowly approaches, most will agree that the role of Africa as a global partner will increase with the continuous and stable development in the African continent and nations. As major players in the economic global market, today we examine one area of current development in Africa and look at some of its implications of this strategy. This area is China investments in Africa. Joining me in today's discussion is Kevin Marunge. Before we begin our discussion, let's watch a short video on China and Africa.
Expected this to be a bit controversial, but I think is the increasing perception or the increasing awareness in Africa that somehow engagement with the new partners, particularly China, because China is the largest new, emerging power in Africa, it's quite mutually beneficial to Africa than what has been the case with traditional development.
For some of the reasons being quite obvious, that 50 years of development partnership with the West is what we have in Africa. I'm not attributing Africa's conditions to that, but we haven't seen much change. And in fact, this frustration is shared by people in the West as well. The citizens of the West are also questioning, after billions of years poured into Africa, why haven't we seen much change? And that's a very legitimate concern on the part of donors, citizens. But Africans are even more acutely aware of that and are beginning to question, are there alternatives to traditional donor partnerships? And at the level of attitude, China sees its interest or its development as directly linked with Africa's development, or at least with Africa. One could, for the benefit of the doubt, and say, well, is Chinese interest really about Africa's development? But the point is, concretely, empirically, on the ground, China's engagement in Africa has always resulted in some productive asset or some productive sector being left whether it's in the form of infrastructure or whatever. I'm quite disagreeable by the fact that, by the comment that Chinese give donations and gain access to African oil. I don't think most of the agreements, the partnerships with African countries have been in the form of either barter trade or some kind of concrete exchange in the form of investment, whatever, that leaves visible concrete asset on the ground, especially in the productive economic sector, rather than in the human development sector. And I think Africans have grown to accept the fact that the engagement with China is about productivity, economic growth and development, and the engagement with traditional donors is about the soft issues, human development, education, health, MDGs. In fact, that's what it is about. China does not worry too much about MDGs. China engages African countries and leave roads and factories. And I mean, you should visit Ethiopia. I've lived in Ethiopia for 7 years. Over the last 5 years alone, I think the Chinese have built within the capital city of Addis Ababa more than 600 kilometers of roads in Addis Ababa. When I moved to Addis, it took me 2 hours to get from home to my office. It takes me less than 20 minutes today because of Chinese roads. I mean, that is tangible, concrete, productive, I mean, in economic terms. So I think this is where the perception is coming from. Whether it's real, it's another question. But I think the perception is that Chinese engagement is more concrete, it's visible, it leaves something more productive. And I think Africans have resigned themselves to the fact that we engage China for one thing, we engage the West for another kind of, the normative things, the discussions, all the things we've talked about today should be left to the West. But when we want something concrete, we go to China. And that's the reality of today's world. And I think we need to live with that. Now, to go straight directly to the earlier issue raised by Dr. Kabonde about trilateral, can Africans, or can the West talk to Africa through China or the other way around? I mean, in other words, China must join the community of donors in order to deal with Africa. And China said, well, actually Africans have said, why must we go through the OECD DAC to engage China? And China's attitude is, we did not contribute to this OECD architecture, norms and values. All these things are Western assumptions or Western values. Why must China subscribe to values they did not contribute in creating in the first place? If you look at Paris and all these things, these are all part and parcel of the 50 years or more of aid industry and its continual renewal and refinement and so on and so on. So China does not see itself, for them it's perhaps a waste of time to be subscribing to the dark OECD normative principles in order to engage Africa at a more practical level. That is not to say that China's engagement in Africa does not perhaps indirectly undermine democracy and governance. I think there's a real concern that the regimes that do not care about human rights and governance will use the China engagement as an excuse to bypass global norms also, which not just for the West, but I think the United Nations is also trying to promote. So those are real concerns. But I was just relaying the perception in Africa that if you want concrete things, you go to China. If you want to engage in endless discussions and discourse, you go to the normal traditional donors. And it's fine, you subscribe to, you discuss those things, but perhaps nothing comes out. So I think the challenge really is on the West to prove that partnership can really yield some concrete outcomes and results.
The DAC standards also reflect the need for developed countries, for democratic Western countries, to ensure legitimacy of their aid to their own citizens, so, which China doesn't need. So it means that we need to have some global frame ensuring good standards because our citizens want to have this for being prepared to give nearly 1% of their income or 0.7% of their income to third countries. And this is the real point. Although we have a market economy with this more greater separation between public and private, we have also financial constraints and so on, which make that indeed, from legitimacy point of view and from point of view of the economic system, China obviously a greater margin of maneuvers. And no, we have to have this also in mind. So we cannot replicate indeed what China does, but we need to understand how we can make our aid better, having a greater impact on growth indeed. No, but on sustainable growth. And that's the issue, because I'm not so sure. This is not only a question of democratic governance, it's also of the sustainability of growth, it's also of the social standards which are being applied, where indeed we try at least to improve social standards in Africa. I'm not sure it is the case for China. So there is a lot of questions which need to be raised in this context.
Kevin, there's a lot of issues being raised in this video. I mean, you look at the fact that China has invests over $270 billion annually in Africa, mainly in infrastructure. It's now China is Africa's leading trading partner. China trade is over $200 billion with Africa. Do you agree with the statement? If you want something concrete, you go to China, and if you want continuous dialogue, you go to the West?
Again, I don't think it's as zero-sum as he made it sound. There is frustration that in the context of 50 years since a lot of these countries gained their independence, there hasn't been much with the current aid structure as it's set up. And within the last 5 years, if you go to some of these capital cities, Nairobi, Addis Ababa, Kampala, you'll see futuristic road networks that have come up with Chinese support. So there's a frustration, I know, among the African governments, especially when you consider the historical approach to aid has been, as we've talked about before, prescriptive. Here's what you're going to do with the aid that we're providing. This is what you're going to build. This is the infrastructure that we think that you need. China doesn't have those kind of dictatorial ideas when it comes to the way they conduct their aid. There's a lot of issues that you need to look into when you approach analysis of China's aid kind of regime. What concessions the governments are giving up. There's exploration for natural resources, contracts that are being handed out, sometimes under some nefarious circumstances. Chinese prospecting for natural gas and oil all over the continent and winning those contracts in a way that is in keeping with the way some of these corrupt African governments conduct business, which is the counterpoint to
what they're saying.
Yeah.
This enormous amount of investment in Africa. The current President Barack Obama visited Africa once and is scheduled to visit again twice. I don't think I can recall a president that visited Africa once, more or less twice. Is it too late?
I think in the eyes of a lot of African leaders, it is too late. A lot of these leaders are looking looking east.
Yes.
So Barack Obama, he visited, the first visit was Ghana, South Africa, Tanzania. A lot of countries felt snubbed.
I know.
Including Kenya, my home country. I wasn't too concerned about it because a lot of it is political. But, with that in mind, you see more African leaders traveling to meet with the Chinese Prime Minister or the Chinese President. You see more state visits from the Chinese leadership to these African countries, more trade agreements. As you've mentioned, it's in the region of $200 billion a year worth of trade.
That's a lot.
And that is a lot, and it's actually trade.
Yes.
And we can talk about the other side of the coin is foreign direct investment, where China is still lagging. China does not invest as much in Africa. It still falls behind the United Kingdom, the U.S., and Italy. So maybe there's something to be said for increasing the amount to which China is actually investing in the continent of Africa, not just with the trade aspect as well.
Okay.
But a lot of these countries are looking east because it's too little, too late.
Okay. We see this investment in Africa, and the video talks about the issue of human rights and China's lack of concern on human rights, where the gentleman from the West in the video talked about that framed their trade, that framed their aid. Should China take in consideration issues of human rights? Is that a element in aid and trade?
I think it is, and I was a bit taken aback by the dismissiveness with which the first speaker in the video addressed soft issues, as he called them.
Sure, absolutely.
Human development issues, because you can't have economic development without human development. You need education. You need access to healthcare. You need people to be health professionals to be adequately trained, teachers to be adequately trained. Those are the ways you build the economies of these nations from within.
Some will take the position that, well, I agree that we have to address these soft concerns, but in order for the nation to develop, we have to have a blind eye to those soft concerns so we can build the basic structures and put that in place and go from there. Now, others will disagree.
Right, and I think you're seeing this argument almost at play in real time in a country like Rwanda,
Absolutely.
which is booming economically,
Yeah.
under what a lot of people would fairly suggest might be a suppressive form of government.
Absolutely.
So what do you do in a situation like that? Are you satisfied with the economic development and the suppression of the political space for the sake of that the sake of that economic development? It's a difficult.
Yeah, but that seemed to be the position which China took in terms of its development. The citizens of China almost accepted a squashing of some rights for economic development as a payoff.
And that's the interesting difference with a lot of these African nations that maybe a lot of observers don't know about is they have robust, engaged, involved civil societies that actually stand up to their governments and hold their governments to account. So China doesn't seem to recognize or care to recognize the gap between the government and the governed in a lot of these countries. The governed don't like the way business is being conducted. They don't like the way contracts are being handed to Chinese firms without any oversight or regulation. And they're, active around these issues.
If that being the case, let's take the case that you brought up, Uganda. The president of Uganda has been in office close to 30 years. Why haven't people voted him out?
In that situation, I think it's a legacy of a liberator. Yoweri Museveni came to power at a time when the country had been through a tremendous amount, from Milton Obote to Idi Amin.
Right. I remember Idi Amin.
So I think there's a generation of Ugandans who will always vote for Museveni as a liberator. And it's not only Uganda that has that kind of sensibility. There's a generation of Zimbabweans who will always vote for Mugabe.
So my point is, so to the actual people they're governed, they're not perceived as repressive.
To segments of the
To
population.
segments.
Yes.
I guess you're right with that. To segments of the population.
Yeah.
But sometimes the West lumps it into one category.
Yes.
And don't necessarily take in some of the historical points that you just brought out, or some of the factual points in terms of and the view from the inside.
Right. And what China has to be careful of now is not being perceived as a kind of new imperialist who takes out raw materials and
Sure.
asks then the countries in the African nations to be a market for finished products without, like we had mentioned before, transferring any of those skills in between the raw materials and the finished products. You have to give people, you have to build capacity if you're actually interested in development, which a lot of folks are saying that China is not building capacity.
Okay. There's been some side effects of this relationship between China and Africa. Some interesting side effects, to say the least. For one, the number of Africans living in China has increased, maybe not significantly, but there is a presence that was not there 40, 50 years ago. And another interesting side effect that I thought was kind of interesting was the fact that, well, China has this one-child policy, and as most people know, there are more males and not enough females to go around. And the construction workers that necessarily that work in Africa, we see an increase in marriage between Chinese construction workers and African women. It's a side effect, and I don't think either government has a problem with either side effect.
No, it's manifesting itself in some fairly amusing ways. There's, I think, a radio talk show recently in Kenya where young men were calling in to complain about losing their spouses to Chinese workers
Really?
because they have the money, and you know it's something that I notice whenever I go home these days. There's definitely an increased population. There's some intermarriage.
Sure.
And then the flip side, the other issue you mentioned is increasing populations of Africans in China. I think that's a positive thing.
Sure.
Especially if you're making access to tertiary education possible for young Africans.
Yeah. When I was in China, it was in 2008. I took a group of students, and I remember hearing that at that time, and that was 7, 8 years ago, that China was offering the continent of Africa 1,000 scholarships, and I'm sure that's a much higher number today. Let me bring this to a different issue. We look at this development, this massive development taking place in parts of Africa, the infrastructure, and some have complained, well, they're bringing in their own workers, and they're only hiring Africans for low-paying minimum jobs.
Right. That's the concern that you know we touched on a second ago. You have to, when you're winning these contracts for these big infrastructure projects, you have to at the same time, if you're really interested in development, which we question whether China is sometimes, you have to build the capacity of the local population, so that when you leave, it's sustainable development. The people have been trained to maybe build huge infrastructure projects in the next city, and they don't need the Chinese company to come back in. That's when you're really interested in development. You build capacity.
That's a good point, because some will say, well, construction in China in the last couple of years has been on the downtrend. And one way for the government to prevent major unemployment and to keep these major, huge corporations going is this foreign investment.
Right.
And so there are alternative motives. I guess we can look at alternative motives with mostly anything.
Alternative motives has been you know part and parcel with development and aid as it concerns Africa.
Kevin, does Africa run the risk of putting all its eggs in one basket when we talk about this relationship with China?
I think that issue, unfortunately, will sort itself out from the China side, because China is already looking beyond Africa. China is already looking to Latin America. So, yeah. So I think for the African nations, having diversified investments coming from several different regions, coming from traditional Western investors coming from the East, all of those need to remain applicable because you can't count on just one major donor or one major trade partner because China has its own ambitions and is already looking to move on.
Kevin, once again, we're out of time, and I'd like to thank you for being on the show. It's been extremely informative.
Thank you so much for having me.
There's very little possibility of turning the clock back. While the West left an opening, China took advantage and solidified its relationship with most sub-Saharan nations. China undertook major infrastructure development, including the superhighway in Kenya, building the Capitol building in Mali, numerous major projects in other African nations, and surpassed the UK in trade in Uganda. There's no doubt that China stepped in when no other nations were willing, and it looks like the African-China connection will be here for a long time. Make no mistake, China gains both in trade for raw material and projects for its massive construction company. Both are important to the Chinese economy, but Africa also gains in big ways. Let's keep in mind that Goldman Sachs predicts by the year 2020, 5 years from now, the Chinese economy will be equal to that of the United States. And by the year 2080, the Chinese economy will be double of the United States. China, which has a huge population of 1.3 billion individuals and its enormous economic capacity, seem to be turning out to be a good deal for Africa. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoy the show, and I'll see you next month on the next second Saturday.